I walked into the massive, imposing federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, expecting a highly annoying but ultimately manageable morning. I was 34 years old. I was wearing a sharp, tailored gray executive suit, my hair pulled back into a neat, professional chignon, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I had told my executive assistant to clear my morning schedule for a personal legal mediation. I thought I was here for a simple civil dispute. 6 months ago, my parents, Martin and Evelyn Calder, had aggressively demanded a $50, zero loan to help pay for my younger sister Felicity's extravagant wedding and a down payment on a new house. I had refused. I didn't refuse because I didn't have the money. I refused because my family had treated me like absolute garbage for my entire life, viewing me as the socially awkward, utterly disappointing black sheep who worked in a windowless basement fixing computers. They thought I was a low-level IT support worker, struggling to pay rent. They thought I was a failure. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that for the last 8 years, I had been building a massive corporate empire. I was the founder and CEO of Sentinel Ledger Systems, a highly specialized elite cybersecurity and fintech firm that protected the digital assets of Fortune 500 companies and international banks. I didn't work in a basement. I worked in a massive corner office overlooking the Chicago River. I didn't struggle to pay rent. I owned a massive multi-million-dollar luxury condo downtown, entirely paid off in cash. My verified, SEC-documented net worth was $85 million. But I kept my wealth entirely hidden from my toxic family. I drove a reliable black Range Rover, dressed modestly when I saw them, and let them believe whatever narrative made them feel superior. It was the only way to survive holiday dinners. When my parents' lawyer, Arthur Fenwick, had sent me a summons for a federal mediation regarding interfamily financial obligations, I had simply rolled my eyes, hired Beatrice Wren, one of the most ruthless, brilliant corporate defense attorneys in the city, and showed up to firmly, legally establish boundaries. But as I walked through the heavy double doors of courtroom 4B and saw my entire family sitting at the plaintiff's table, I immediately realized this wasn't a mediation. This was an ambush. All rise, the heavy-set bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing off the dark wood paneling of the courtroom. The Honorable Judge Nathaniel Brooks presiding. Judge Brooks, a stern, deeply experienced federal judge, known for handling complex bankruptcy and corporate fraud cases, walked out from his chambers and took his seat behind the massive wooden bench. He looked down at the docket, his expression entirely serious. I sat at the defense table next to Beatrice, who was calmly organizing a stack of highly classified, heavily sealed folders. "Counsel," Judge Brooks said, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. "We are here for an emergency ex parte hearing regarding a petition for conservatorship filed by Martin and Evelyn Calder against their daughter, Rowena Calder. Mr. Fenwick, you represent the petitioners?" My blood completely froze. Conservatorship? I looked across the aisle at my family. My mother, Evelyn, was already dabbing her eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the role of the devastated, heartbroken matriarch. My father, Martin, sat next to her, looking stoic and deeply concerned. Sitting directly behind them in the gallery was my younger sister, Felicity. She was the golden child, the perfect daughter who had married the perfect man. She was currently 5 months pregnant, resting her hand protectively on her stomach. Next to her was her husband, Dorian Price. Dorian was a slick, incredibly arrogant investment broker at Northbridge Wealth Partners. He was wearing a flashy designer suit, a heavy gold watch, and a deeply condescending smirk. When Dorian caught my eye across the courtroom, he actually had the absolute, breathtaking audacity to wink at me. They weren't here to sue me for $50,000. They were here to legally strip me of my fundamental human rights. "Yes, Your Honor," Arthur Fenwick said, standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He was a slick, high-priced family lawyer who clearly thought this was an easy payday. "We are asking the court to grant an immediate, emergency conservatorship over Rowena Calder's person and her entire estate. We are asking that full legal and financial control be immediately transferred to her parents, Martin and Evelyn Calder." "On what grounds, Mr. Fenwick?" Judge Brooks asked, adjusting his reading glasses. Conservatorship is a massive revocation of civil liberties. It is not granted lightly. On the grounds of severe, rapidly deteriorating mental incapacity and catastrophic financial insolvency, Your Honor, Fenwick stated boldly, his voice ringing with absolute practiced conviction. I stared at him, my mind racing. Catastrophic financial insolvency. I had $85 million in liquid and corporate assets. My client's daughter, Fenwick continued, gesturing dramatically toward me, has suffered a total, unrecoverable psychological break from reality. She is deeply paranoid, utterly incapable of managing her basic daily life, and is currently hiding from massive, crushing debt. If the court does not intervene today, she will lose everything she has left. She is a danger to herself. The court will hear testimony, Judge Brooks said, his expression tightening. He took cases of mental incapacity very seriously. Rowena Calder was called to the witness stand first. My mother walked slowly, dramatically up to the wooden box, clutching a small, heavily embroidered handkerchief. She swore to tell the truth, sat down, and immediately began to cry. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance. Mrs. Calder, Fenwick asked gently, guiding her through the rehearsed testimony. Can you please describe your daughter's mental state over the past year? It's been a nightmare, Evelyn sobbed, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes. Rowena has always been difficult. She works a terrible, dead-end IT support job. She sits in a dark room staring at computer screens all day. About a year ago, she just snapped. She stopped answering our calls. She became incredibly paranoid. She started talking about cyber attacks and federal security clearances. Delusions of grandeur. She thinks she's running some massive company, but she can barely afford to eat. I sat perfectly still, my face a cold, unreadable mask. A year ago, Sentinel ledger systems had successfully thwarted a massive state-sponsored cyber attack against a major European bank. I had worked 90 hours a week for a month straight, coordinating directly with federal agencies. I had been exhausted, yes, but I wasn't delusional. I was doing my job. She is isolating herself, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling perfectly. She lives alone in that condo. We are terrified she's going to hurt herself. We just want our daughter back. We just want to take care of her. Thank you, Mrs. Calder, Fenwick said softly, turning to the judge to let the emotional manipulation sink in. I looked at Beatrice. She didn't look worried. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly, dangerously bored. She was writing something on her yellow legal pad. I glanced over. She had drawn a tiny, perfect picture of a shark. Does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness? Judge Brooks asked, looking at Beatrice. No questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor. Beatrice said smoothly, not even looking up from her legal pad. Fenwick looked slightly surprised, but he quickly recovered, clearly believing he had completely intimidated us. Felicity was called to the stand next, the pregnant golden child. She walked up to the box, placing her hand on her stomach, projecting an aura of sweet, innocent, sisterly concern. Felicity, Fenwick asked, you are Rowena's younger sister. How has her mental decline affected your relationship? It breaks my heart, Felicity said, her voice soft and fragile. I'm having my first baby. I want my sister to be a part of this child's life. But Rowena is entirely unstable. She's hostile. She's deeply in debt. Dorian and I have tried so hard to help her. We even offered to take over her condo, to let her move into the basement of my parents' house where she can be properly supervised and cared for. We want to lift the financial burden off her shoulders. My eyes narrowed. The absolute, breathtaking greed of my family suddenly crystallized in the cold air of the courtroom. They didn't care about my mental health. They cared about the real estate. My riverfront condo was a massive, highly sought-after luxury property in downtown Chicago. I had bought it 5 years ago in a private cash sale. Because I am fiercely private, my name wasn't on the public registry. It was held in a blind trust, but my family knew I lived there. They assumed I was renting it, or that I had somehow secured a massive mortgage I couldn't afford. Felicity wanted the condo. She wanted my massive, beautiful home to raise her new baby. And she wanted Dorian to get it for her for free. And to get it, they were entirely willing to legally declare me insane and lock me in my parents' basement as a permanent, voiceless dependent. No questions for this witness, Your Honor, Beatrice said again, her voice entirely flat. Very well, Judge Brooks said, looking at Fenwick. Counsel, emotional testimony is compelling, but conservatorship requires hard evidence of financial incapacity. Do you have proof of this massive debt? We absolutely do, Your Honor, Fenwick said, a deeply triumphant smile spreading across his slick face. I call our expert witness, Mr. Dorian Price. Dorian stood up from the gallery. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, adjusted his heavy gold watch, and strutted confidently to the witness box. He looked like a man who was about to win the lottery. He swore the oath, sat down, and leaned into the microphone. Please state your name and profession for the record, Fenwick requested. Dorian Price, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. I am a senior investment broker and portfolio manager at Northbridge Wealth Partners. I handle high-level asset management, complex debt restructuring, and institutional risk assessment. Mr. Price, Fenwick said, walking toward the witness box and handing him a thick stack of printed documents. As a financial expert and a concerned family member, did you conduct an investigation into Rowena Calder's financial situation? I did, Dorian said, nodding solemnly. Because of Rowena's escalating paranoia and her refusal to speak with the family, I used my professional resources to run a deep-level credit and asset check. What I found was absolutely catastrophic. Dorian held up the stack of documents for the judge to see. Rowena is not just struggling, Your Honor, Dorian stated, his voice ringing with absolute, practiced authority. She is in a massive, inescapable death spiral of debt. She is an IT support worker making perhaps $60,000 a year, but she is currently carrying over $400,000 in highly leveraged, toxic debt. He began reading off the documents. I have here official bank statements, default notices, and severe collection letters. Dorian continued smoothly, presenting the papers as undeniable, absolute fact. She has maxed out 6 different high-interest credit cards. But the most terrifying part is this margin loan document from a secondary brokerage account. She borrowed heavily against non-existent equity to try and cover her credit card minimums. The margin call triggered 2 weeks ago. She is technically insolvent. If the court does not grant the conservatorship today, the banks will seize everything, including her primary residence. I stared at the documents in Dorian's hand. I didn't have $400,000 in debt. I hadn't carried a credit card balance since I was in college. Every single document he was holding was an absolute, complete forgery. But Dorian was an investment broker. He knew exactly what a federal judge needed to see to grant an emergency asset freeze. He had used his financial expertise to carefully craft a completely fake, incredibly convincing portrait of a woman drowning in toxic debt. He was committing massive federal perjury right in front of my eyes. Your Honor, Fenwick said, turning dramatically to face Judge Brooks. The evidence is overwhelming and entirely undeniable. Rowena Calder is suffering a severe psychotic break. She is completely financially ruined. If you do not sign the emergency conservatorship order today, transferring all of her assets and property to her parents, she will be out on the street by the end of the week. We are begging the court to save her from herself. Fenwick walked back to the plaintiff's table and sat down, looking incredibly satisfied. Evelyn was crying softly. Martin was holding her hand. Felicity was staring at me, a tiny, deeply vindictive smile playing on her lips. She thought she already owned my condo. Judge Brooks looked at the thick stack of financial documents Dorian had just entered into the official court record. He looked troubled. The forged evidence was incredibly detailed. He picked up his pen. Miss Wren? Judge Brooks said, looking directly at Beatrice, his voice heavy with the gravity of the decision he was about to make. The petitioners have presented a highly disturbing, heavily documented case of severe financial incompetence and mental instability. If the defense does not have an immediate, substantial rebuttal, I am strongly inclined to grant the emergency asset freeze and temporary conservatorship. The pen hovered over the legal order that would instantly strip me of my rights, my money, and my life. I didn't panic. I didn't scream that they were lying. I leaned over and whispered exactly 4 words to Beatrice. Beatrice stopped drawing the tiny shark on her legal pad. She set her pen down. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her expensive blazer, and looked directly at Dorian Price, who was still sitting smugly in the witness box. "The defense is finally ready to begin cross-examination, Your Honor," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing out like a heavy steel blade dropping onto a concrete floor. "And we would like to start with the expert witness." Dorian Price settled back into the heavy wooden chair of the witness box. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, leaned casually toward the microphone, and offered Beatrice Wren a deeply condescending, incredibly smug smile. He was a senior investment broker. He spent his entire day verbally manipulating wealthy clients and intimidating junior analysts. He genuinely, profoundly believed he was the absolute smartest person in the federal courtroom. He thought he was about to easily, effortlessly swat away a desperate defense lawyer and walk out of the building with the keys to my luxury downtown condo. He had absolutely no idea that he had just walked into a legal slaughterhouse. Beatrice didn't walk toward the witness box. She didn't yell. She didn't pound her fist on the table. She simply stood at the defense desk, holding a single piece of paper from the massive stack of forged financial documents Dorian had just submitted into the official court record. "Mr. Price," Beatrice began, her voice incredibly calm, almost dangerously quiet. "You testified under oath that you are a highly experienced financial expert, correct? A senior investment broker at Northbridge Wealth Partners." "That is correct," Dorian replied smoothly, projecting absolute confidence. "I manage complex portfolios and highly leveraged debt structures on a daily basis." "Excellent," Beatrice said, offering a tiny, incredibly sharp smile. "Then you should have absolutely no problem explaining the fundamental mechanics of the documents you just submitted to this federal court." Beatrice held up the paper in her hand. "You submitted a document claiming that my client, Rowena Calder, who you testified is a low-level IT support worker, making $60,000 a year, took out a massive $200,000 margin loan to cover her credit card debt," Beatrice stated clearly. "Is that an accurate summary of your testimony?" "Yes," Dorian nodded firmly. "It's all right there in the paperwork." The margin call triggered because the underlying assets lost value, forcing her into immediate insolvency. "Fascinating," Beatrice said flatly. She walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, holding the paper up toward the judge. "Your Honor, as Mr. Price is a financial expert, I'm sure he knows that under Regulation T of the Federal Reserve Board, a standard retail brokerage account cannot extend a margin loan that exceeds 50% of the initial purchase price of the securities in the account." Dorian's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of absolute panic flashed across his eyes. "Mr. Price," Beatrice continued, her voice rising slightly, the trap beginning to snap shut. "If Rowena is an IT worker making $60,000 a year, struggling to pay basic credit card minimums, how exactly did she secure a massive $200,000 margin loan? To secure a loan of that size under federal banking regulations, her underlying stock portfolio would have to be worth at least $400,000 in highly liquid, unrestricted assets. Did she have $400,000 in retail stocks sitting in a standard brokerage account?" Dorian hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked nervously at Arthur Fenwick, the family lawyer, who suddenly looked incredibly pale. I don't have access to her full asset history," Dorian stammered, the smooth, confident broker facade rapidly cracking under the pressure of basic banking logic. "I only have the debt notices. The bank must have made an exception or miscalculated the risk profile. A major federal bank miscalculated a margin loan by 400%? Beatrice asked, her voice dripping with absolute, freezing sarcasm. "For a retail worker? Objection!" Fenwick shouted, standing up quickly, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "Counsel is badgering the witness and asking him to speculate on internal banking procedures." Overruled. Judge Brooks barked sharply, leaning forward over the massive wooden bench, his eyes locked intensely on Dorian. The judge had spent decades handling complex bankruptcy cases. He immediately saw the glaring, massive hole in the financial logic. The witness presented himself as a financial expert and submitted these documents as undeniable proof of insolvency. He will answer the question. How did she secure the loan, Mr. Price? I don't know the exact underwriting details, Your Honor, Dorian muttered, sweating visibly, nervously tugging at the collar of his expensive shirt. I just read the default notice. Let's move on from the impossible margin loan, Beatrice said smoothly, utterly destroying his credibility before pivoting to the fatal blow. Let's look at the actual account number on this default notice. Beatrice walked over to the court clerk and handed them the forged document. Please project Exhibit C onto the main screen, Beatrice requested. A moment later, the forged banking document Dorian had created appeared on the massive monitors in the courtroom. Beatrice picked up as a laser pointer and aimed the red dot directly at the top right corner of the document. Mr. Price, can you please read the account classification code listed directly beneath the routing number? Beatrice asked. Dorian squinted at the screen. He was heavily sweating now. He had spent hours perfectly forging the balances, the threatening legal language, and the bank logos, but he hadn't paid attention to the tiny alphanumeric classification codes generated by the banking software template he had stolen from his office. It says, CORP 7, Dorian read quietly, his voice shaking. 7. Beatrice repeated loudly, ensuring the entire courtroom heard it. Your Honor, in the federal banking system, specifically within the clearinghouses used by Northbridge Wealth Partners, the classification code, CORP 7, is exclusively reserved for institutional corporate entities and massive shell companies. Beatrice turned off the laser pointer and stared directly at Dorian. It is never, under any circumstances, issued to a personal retail checking account or a standard individual brokerage account, Beatrice stated, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. Mr. Price, you testified that this was Rowena's personal debt. Why does the bank consider her personal checking account a massive corporate entity? Dorian was completely paralyzed. He stared at the screen in absolute horror. He had used a highly complex corporate margin template from his wealth management firm to forge the documents, assuming no one in a family court would ever understand the tiny, specialized banking codes. He thought he was dealing with a clueless judge and a naive lawyer. He didn't know Beatrice had spent 10 years defending Wall Street hedge funds from SEC investigations. I can't explain the bank's internal coding system, Dorian stammered desperately, looking wildly around the room for an exit. It must be a clerical error on their end. A clerical error, Beatrice asked, shaking her head slowly in mock disbelief. That seems highly unlikely, considering the account number listed on this forged document actually exists. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. My mother, Evelyn, stopped her fake crying. Felicity grabbed the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning completely white. What do you mean it actually exists? Judge Brooks asked, his voice suddenly sharp, extremely dangerous, and highly alert. He was no longer looking at a simple family dispute. He was looking at a massive, complex fraud. Your Honor, Beatrice said, turning to address the bench directly. When I reviewed the documents Mr. Price submitted this morning, my client, Ms. Calder, immediately recognized the primary account number listed on the fake default notices. I looked at Dorian. Our eyes locked across the courtroom. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a highly explosive landmine. 6 months ago, my family had invited me to a tense, highly uncomfortable Sunday dinner to beg for the $50,000 loan. During the dinner, Dorian had excused himself to use the restroom. He had been gone for nearly 20 minutes. I lived in a massive multi-million-dollar condo, but I kept one small room looking like a messy, disorganized home office, specifically for when my family visited, to maintain the illusion that I was a struggling IT worker. I kept old, entirely dormant junk mail and useless bank statements piled on the desk to complete the facade. Dorian hadn't gone to the restroom. He had snuck into that home office. He had rummaged through the messy piles of mail, found an old statement for a completely dormant, entirely empty checking account I hadn't used in 10 years, and taken a photo of the account and routing numbers with his phone. He had stolen my actual, verifiable banking information to lend absolute credibility to his massive forgery. My client recognized the account number as a dormant checking account she opened in college and abandoned over a decade ago. Beatrice explained to the judge. Because she knew the account number was real, but the massive debt was entirely fake, we immediately ran a forensic corporate trace on the routing structure. Beatrice reached into her thick legal binder and pulled out a new, highly official-looking document with a massive state seal stamped on the front. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Defense Exhibit A," Beatrice announced. "This is an official, certified corporate filing from the Delaware Secretary of State." She handed a copy to the clerk, who projected it onto the main screen next to Dorian's forged document. "The account number that Mr. Price claims represents my client's massive personal debt," Beatrice said, pointing at the screen, "is actually the primary operational account for a Delaware shell company called Crown Point Holdings, LLC. Dorian physically slumped in the witness chair. He looked like he was going to vomit. "Crown Point Holdings?" Judge Brooks asked, reading the massive screen. "Who owns this shell company?" "According to the heavily masked corporate filings, it is a blind trust," Beatrice answered smoothly. "However, Delaware requires the IP address and the digital signature of the individual who physically registered the LLC online." Beatrice flipped to the second page of the state filing on the screen. "The IP address used to create Crown Point Holdings, LLC, the shell company currently holding the fake debt Mr. Price just testified my client owes." Beatrice paused, letting the absolute, crushing silence fill the massive room. Traces directly to a highly secure computer terminal located inside the downtown offices of Northbridge Wealth Partners. Beatrice turned slowly and looked directly at the slick, arrogant investment broker sitting in the witness box. "Specifically," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper, "the IP address belongs to the primary workstation of senior investment broker Dorian Price." The courtroom absolutely exploded. "Objection! Objection!" Arthur Fenwick screamed, jumping out of his chair, completely losing his mind. He realized he had just aggressively submitted forged documents to a federal judge on behalf of a client who was actively committing massive wire fraud. He was desperately trying to save his own legal license. "This is entirely speculative. Defense counsel is ambushing the witness with unverified cyber forensics." "Sit down, Mr. Fenwick," Judge Brooks roared, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. The judge was furious. He hated being lied to, and he absolutely despised being used as a tool for financial fraud. Judge Brooks turned his furious, burning gaze onto Dorian Price. "Mr. Price," Judge Brooks demanded, his voice echoing with absolute federal authority, "did you use your position at a wealth management firm to create a Delaware shell company, steal your sister-in-law's dormant account number, and forge massive financial debt documents to present to this court today?" Dorian was hyperventilating. He was trapped. He couldn't lie. The IP trace was absolute, undeniable digital proof. If he lied under oath now, he was committing another massive felony. I respectfully invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, Your Honor," Dorian stammered, his slick, arrogant voice completely reduced to a pathetic, terrified whisper. "By invoking the Fifth Amendment in a civil conservatorship hearing." Dorian had just legally admitted that answering the question would expose him to massive criminal charges. He had just admitted the fraud. The silence that followed was completely deafening. My parents, Martin and Evelyn, sat frozen in absolute, paralyzing shock at the plaintiff's table. Their perfect son-in-law, the wealthy investment broker they constantly praised and compared me to, had just invoked the Fifth Amendment to avoid confessing to federal forgery on the witness stand. But Felicity couldn't handle the silence. The golden child, the perfect, pregnant sister who was entirely, ruthlessly obsessed with stealing my luxury condo to build her dream nursery, completely snapped under the terrifying pressure. "Dorian, what did you do?" Felicity shrieked, standing up in the gallery, pointing a shaking finger at her husband in the witness box. Her carefully crafted image of innocent, sisterly concern completely vanished, replaced by pure, desperate, vicious greed. You said the paperwork was flawless. You said the judge would sign the order and we would get the condo today. He was just trying to get us the condo. Felicity's scream echoed through the massive courtroom. She had just accidentally, publicly, and completely confessed to the entire malicious motive behind the conservatorship. They didn't care about my mental health. They didn't care about my well-being. They just wanted my real estate. Judge Brooks looked at Felicity, then looked at my parents, his expression twisting into one of absolute, profound disgust. "Mr. Fenwick," Judge Brooks said, his voice dangerously low, "your clients are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court for attempting to weaponize this tribunal for massive real estate theft. Your Honor, I had absolutely no knowledge of these forged documents." Fenwick stammered desperately, physically backing away from my parents' table, trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. "I relied entirely on the financial expertise of Mr. Price." "Save it, counsel," Judge Brooks snapped, turning back to Beatrice. "Miss Wren, you have successfully dismantled the petitioner's entire case and exposed a massive fraud. The emergency conservatorship is entirely denied. We are done here." Judge Brooks picked up his heavy wooden gavel, ready to officially dismiss the case and end the hearing. "We are not done here, Your Honor," Beatrice said loudly, her voice stopping the judge mid-swing. The judge looked at her, surprised. She had already won. Why was she stopping the dismissal? "The defense is not finished," Beatrice stated, picking up the thick, black, heavily sealed folder she had brought into the courtroom. "Mr. Price did not just forge a few documents to steal a condo. The scope of his fraud is significantly, massively larger than this family dispute, and it directly, maliciously targets my client's true corporate identity." Beatrice held up the black folder. Stamped on the front, in bold, unmistakable letters, was the official seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Dorian Price looked at the folder, and the last remaining drop of color completely drained from his face. He knew exactly what was inside. "Your Honor," Beatrice announced, the final lethal trap officially springing shut. "I would like to submit Defense Exhibit B, the sealed SEC investigation into Northbridge Wealth Partners. The mention of the Securities and Exchange Commission in a family court conservatorship hearing was the legal equivalent of dropping a tactical nuclear weapon onto a chessboard." Judge Brooks immediately stopped organizing his paperwork. He looked at the thick, black folder in Beatrice's hand, then looked back at Dorian Price. Dorian was no longer just sweating. He was visibly, violently shaking. His eyes darted frantically toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, calculating the physical distance, assessing if he could run before the bailiff tackled him. "Counsel," Judge Brooks said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous impatience, now ringing with cold, absolute federal authority. "You are introducing a sealed SEC investigation into a family dispute. You are making an incredibly serious, potentially highly dangerous procedural leap. Explain the relevance immediately." Beatrice stated calmly, walking the black folder directly up to the bench, "Is that the petitioner's primary witness, Mr. Dorian Price, just committed massive federal perjury by submitting forged documents to this court. He claimed my client was a bankrupt IT support worker to justify seizing her real estate." Beatrice handed the folder to the judge. "But the documents he forged," Beatrice continued, her voice echoing in the silent room, "were built using the highly sensitive corporate architecture of my client's actual company, a company that is currently working directly with the federal government." Judge Brooks took the heavy folder. He broke the red wax seal on the front and opened it. He pulled out a thick stack of highly classified, heavily redacted financial documents. He began reading the first page. His eyebrows shot up instantly. He looked at the document, then looked across the courtroom at me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the defense table. I met his gaze with absolute, cold composure. I wasn't an IT worker terrified of debt. I was a corporate titan waiting for the execution to begin. For the record, Judge Brooks read aloud, his deep voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent courtroom. This SEC document confirms the verified, highly vetted corporate identity of the defendant, Rowena Calder. Ms. Calder is not an IT support worker. My parents, Martin and Evelyn, leaned forward at the plaintiff's table, their faces pale, incredibly confused. Felicity had stopped crying and was staring at the judge, her mouth slightly open. Rowena Calder, Judge Brooks continued, reading directly from the federal document, is the founder, the chief executive officer, and the majority shareholder of Sentinel Ledger Systems, an elite cybersecurity and fintech infrastructure firm. The judge paused, turning the page. The SEC confirms, Judge Brooks read, the numbers hitting the courtroom like physical blows, that Sentinel Ledger Systems holds highly lucrative, multi-year contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies and 2 international banking syndicates. Ms. Calder's personally verified, SEC-audited net worth is currently valued at over $85 million. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion. Evelyn Calder audibly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in pure, unadulterated shock. Martin Calder stared at me, his eyes wide, completely paralyzed. Felicity looked like she had just been physically struck. She looked at me, her disappointing, loser older sister, the woman whose condo she was actively trying to steal, and realized she was staring at an $85 million corporate titan. The absolute sheer magnitude of her miscalculation washed over her face, draining it of all color. 85 million? Felicity whispered into the dead silence of the courtroom, her voice cracking. But you wear cheap sweaters. You drive an old Range Rover. I drive a highly armored, fully bulletproof Range Rover, Felicity, I said softly from the defense table, my voice cold and incredibly precise. Because my company protects massive, highly sensitive financial assets. And I wear cheap sweaters around you because I knew the absolute second you found out I had money, you would immediately try to steal it. And I was exactly right. Your Honor, Beatrice interrupted smoothly, drawing the judge's attention back to the massive legal bomb she was still detonating. The SEC investigation does not just verify my client's massive net worth and prove the conservatorship petition is an entirely malicious, fraudulent attack. Beatrice pointed a manicured finger directly at Dorian Price, who was currently gripping the wooden railing of the witness box so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The SEC investigation, Beatrice announced, her voice rising to a lethal crescendo, also focuses heavily on the Delaware shell company Mr. Price used to forge my client's fake debt. Crown Point Holdings, LLC. Judge Brooks flipped to the next section of the sealed folder. He began reading rapidly, his eyes scanning the dense, highly technical federal banking ledgers. The more he read, the darker and more furious his expression became. Mr. Price, Judge Brooks said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. According to these SEC tracing documents, Crown Point Holdings LLC is not just a fake company you created to steal your sister-in-law's condo. The judge looked up, his eyes locking onto Dorian like a predator locking onto its prey. Crown Point Holdings, Judge Brooks continued, is a fully operational shadow account, and for the last 18 months, someone at Northbridge Wealth Partners has been using that exact shell company to systematically skim massive, highly illegal microtransfers directly out of their elite clients' investment portfolios. Dorian squeezed his eyes shut. A single drop of sweat rolled down his pale, terrified face. He wasn't just forging a debt, Your Honor, Beatrice explained, ensuring every single person in the courtroom understood the absolute, catastrophic magnitude of Dorian's idiocy. My client's company, Sentinel Ledger Systems, was hired by the SEC 3 weeks ago to assist in tracking a massive embezzlement scheme at Northbridge Wealth Partners. We were quietly analyzing the blockchain and banking transfers. I looked at Dorian, a cold, incredibly satisfying smile finally touching my lips. When Mr. Price decided to steal my identity to forge a fake debt, I said clearly, my voice echoing in the silent room, he was incredibly arrogant. He didn't want to invent a completely fake ledger from scratch, because that requires complex mathematical balancing. So, He took a shortcut. I pointed at the massive screen projecting the forged default notice. He took the actual, highly illegal ledger from his own massive embezzlement scheme at Northbridge. I continued smoothly, slapped my stolen, dormant account number on top of it, and submitted it to this federal court under oath. The absolute, profound stupidity of Dorian's action finally settled over the courtroom. He had literally, physically handed a federal judge the exact, heavily detailed, mathematically flawless proof of his own massive multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud, simply because he was too lazy to invent fake numbers to steal a condo. He had effectively signed his own federal arrest warrant and handed it to the executioner. "Mr. Price," Judge Brooks said, his voice entirely devoid of mercy, "you submitted these documents to this court. You swore under oath that they were accurate." I invoke the Fifth Amendment." Dorian choked out again, his voice barely a terrified squeak. He was completely broken. "You can invoke the Fifth Amendment all you want, Mr. Price," Judge Brooks stated coldly, picking up his gavel. "But you cannot unsubmit evidence that you voluntarily entered into the federal court record. You have just provided this court with highly detailed, sworn documentary proof of massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe perjury." Judge Brooks turned to the heavy-set bailiff standing near the door. "Bailiff," Judge Brooks ordered sharply, "lock the doors to this courtroom immediately. Do not let anyone leave." The bailiff immediately stepped in front of the heavy wooden double doors and locked the deadbolt with a loud, terrifying click. "Contact the United States Marshals Service," Judge Brooks continued, his voice ringing with absolute, inescapable authority. "Inform them that we have an active, highly documented federal wire fraud suspect currently sitting in the witness box of courtroom 4B, and we are holding him for immediate federal custody." Dorian let out a pathetic, terrified whimper. He looked at Felicity, desperate for help. Felicity didn't look at him. She was staring at me in absolute, paralyzing horror. The golden child was watching her perfect, incredibly wealthy husband turn into a massive federal criminal right before her eyes. The luxury condo, the dream nursery, the perfect life. It was all violently, instantaneously evaporating into a massive, highly publicized federal prison sentence. "Arthur," Evelyn whispered desperately, grabbing her lawyer's arm. "Arthur, do something. Stop this. He's our son-in-law." Arthur Fenwick violently ripped his arm out of my mother's grasp. He looked absolutely terrified, furious, and deeply desperate to save his own career. "Your Honor," Fenwick shouted, stepping away from the plaintiff's table, as if my family were suddenly infected with a highly contagious, lethal disease. "For the official court record, I formally request to immediately withdraw as counsel for the petitioners, Martin and Evelyn Calder. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of these forged documents, the embezzlement scheme, or the identity theft. I was entirely, maliciously lied to by my clients and their witness." "Withdrawal granted, Mr. Fenwick," Judge Brooks said sharply. "You are excused, but do not leave the courthouse. The marshals will likely want to interview you regarding your client's malicious use of the legal system." Fenwick grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, didn't even look at my parents, and practically sprinted toward the gallery, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive blast radius. My parents were left sitting entirely alone at the plaintiff's table. They had no lawyer. They had no legal defense. They had no narrative control. They were completely, utterly exposed. "Martin and Evelyn Calder," Judge Brooks said, turning his fierce, burning gaze onto my parents. The judge was absolutely furious. Evelyn tried to cry again. She tried to deploy the heartbroken mother routine one last time. "Save the tears, Mrs. Calder," Judge Brooks snapped, cutting her off instantly. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years. I have seen massive corporate greed, incredible financial malice, and profound human stupidity. But I have rarely seen something as deeply, fundamentally disgusting as what you attempted to do in my courtroom today." The judge leaned forward, his voice echoing with absolute moral disgust. "You came into this federal courthouse," Judge Brooks stated coldly, "and attempted to weaponize the incredible, life-altering power of a legal conservatorship. You attempted to legally strip your own daughter of her fundamental human rights, her autonomy, and her financial independence. You attempted to declare her legally insane and lock her in a basement simply so you could steal her real estate for your other daughter. Martin looked down at the table, completely humiliated, entirely unable to meet the judge's eyes. And the absolute, profound irony, Judge Brooks continued, shaking his head in sheer disbelief, is that the daughter you attempted to brand as a total, incompetent failure is actually a highly successful, brilliant, multi-million-dollar corporate CEO, while the son-in-law you clearly worship is a massive, incredibly incompetent federal criminal. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. The petition for emergency conservatorship is dismissed with extreme, absolute prejudice. Judge Brooks declared loudly, his voice echoing with absolute finality. You are legally barred from ever filing a similar petition in this jurisdiction again. This court is adjourned. He slammed the gavel down. Bang. The sound echoed through the massive courtroom like a physical shockwave. 10 seconds later, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. 3 heavily armed United States Marshals walked briskly down the center aisle, their tactical boots echoing sharply on the hardwood floor. They didn't pause. They didn't ask questions. They walked directly to the witness box. Dorian Price, the lead marshal, said coldly, completely ignoring Dorian's expensive suit and arrogant broker aesthetic. Stand up and place your hands behind your back. Dorian didn't argue. He didn't try to use his slick financial jargon. He was completely, utterly broken. He stood up, trembling violently, and slowly placed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Dorian's wrists echoed loudly in the absolutely silent courtroom. They dragged him out of the witness box, marching him down the center aisle, past his crying wife, past his deeply humiliated in-laws, and out the heavy double doors. The ambush was over. The trap had sprung, and the hunters had been entirely, absolutely annihilated. Judge Brooks gathered his heavy folders, stood up from the massive wooden bench, and exited the courtroom through the private door to his chambers. The heavy-set bailiff followed him, officially unlocking the main double doors of courtroom 4B as he left. The hearing was over. The trap had sprung. I sat at the defense table for a long, quiet moment, simply breathing in the cool, highly air-conditioned air of the federal courthouse. I watched Beatrice neatly, methodically pack the heavily sealed SEC folders back into her expensive leather briefcase. She didn't look triumphant or boastful. She just looked like a professional who had flawlessly executed a highly complex tactical maneuver. Brilliant work, Beatrice, I said quietly, offering her a genuine, rare smile. They made it incredibly easy, Rowena. Beatrice replied smoothly, snapping the brass locks on her briefcase shut. When arrogant men try to use complex financial systems they don't fully understand to steal from women they fundamentally underestimate, they usually end up hanging themselves with their own paperwork. Dorian Price just happened to supply his own rope, tie the knot, and kick the chair out from under himself while under federal oath. I stood up, buttoned my gray executive suit jacket, and picked up my own briefcase. I turned around to leave the courtroom. Standing directly in the center aisle, completely blocking my path to the exit, were my parents and my sister. They looked absolutely destroyed. Martin Calder, the man who had played the stoic, heartbroken father just 20 minutes ago, looked incredibly old and deeply terrified. His shoulders were slumped, his face entirely pale. Evelyn Calder was no longer crying fake, manipulative tears for the judge. She was crying real, desperate, horrified tears. The reality of the situation, that her perfect, wealthy son-in-law was currently sitting in a federal holding cell for massive wire fraud, had finally brutally sunk in. And Felicity, the golden child, the perfect sister who had sat in the gallery, rubbing her pregnant belly, smugly waiting for the judge to hand her the keys to my luxury downtown condo. She looked entirely broken. Her carefully constructed, highly arrogant facade had completely shattered. "Rowena," Evelyn pleaded, stepping forward, her hands shaking violently. She reached out, desperately trying to grab my arm, trying to reestablish the maternal dominance she thought she still possessed. I took a sharp, highly calculated step back, completely avoiding her touch. I looked at her with absolute, freezing indifference. "Don't touch me, Evelyn," I said, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. It was the voice I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. It was cold, precise, and entirely unyielding. Evelyn pulled her hand back as if she had been physically burned. "Rowena, please," Martin begged, his voice cracking, completely abandoning his stoic demeanor. "You have to help us. We didn't know. We didn't know Dorian was stealing money from his clients. We didn't know about the shell company or the SEC investigation. We just thought you were struggling. We just wanted to help you manage your debt." I stared at my father, genuinely amazed by his absolute, breathtaking capacity for delusion. Even now, standing in the ashes of their massive, malicious legal failure, he was still trying to spin the narrative. He was still trying to play the victim. "You didn't want to help me manage my debt, Martin," I replied calmly, my voice echoing in the nearly empty courtroom. "If you actually thought I was struggling, if you actually cared about my well-being as your daughter, you would have offered to pay the debt. You would have offered me a loan. You would have invited me to dinner and asked how I was feeling." I took a step closer, my eyes locking onto his, forcing him to acknowledge the absolute truth of his own profound malice. "But you didn't do that," I continued softly, lethally. "You hired a high-priced, incredibly aggressive family lawyer. You ambushed me in a federal courthouse. You actively attempted to legally declare me insane, strip me of my fundamental human rights, and lock me in your basement as a permanent dependent, entirely so you could steal my real estate and give it to your favorite daughter." I looked at Felicity. She flinched under my gaze, wrapping her arms protectively around her stomach. "You didn't want to save me," I stated coldly. "You wanted to erase me. Rowena, he's going to prison." Felicity suddenly screamed, completely losing whatever fragile control she had left. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "Dorian is going to federal prison. They arrested him right in front of everyone. His firm is going to sue us. The clients he stole from are going to come after our house. I'm pregnant, Rowena. I'm going to be a single mother with absolutely nothing." "That is a profound tragedy, Felicity," I said, entirely unmoved by her hysterical panic. "But it is a tragedy of your own creation. You have $85 million, Felicity shrieked, her voice echoing wildly in the courtroom, entirely abandoning the narrative of the concerned sister, her pure, unadulterated greed finally boiling over. The judge read it from the federal file. "You're a CEO. You have millions of dollars sitting in corporate accounts. You have to help us. You have to hire Beatrice to defend Dorian. You have to post his federal bail. You have to pay back the clients he stole from before they seize our assets." I stared at my sister. She was actually, genuinely demanding that I use the massive wealth she had just discovered to save the exact man who had just attempted to steal my condo and declare me legally insane. The sheer, unfathomable entitlement was almost breathtaking. "Felicity," I said slowly, speaking to her as if she were a deeply confused, incredibly slow child, "I am not going to spend a single cent of my corporate capital defending Dorian Price. I am not going to post his bail. I hope the federal prosecutors bury him under the prison for wire fraud. Your family," Evelyn sobbed, playing her final, desperate, pathetic card. "You can't just abandon us when we're facing total ruin. We're your parents. We raised you. You owe us." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "For 34 years, you treated me like a complete, utter failure simply because I didn't fit into your perfect, superficial narrative. You actively rooted for my downfall so you could feel superior. And when you thought I was finally broken, you didn't offer a hand to pull me up. You offered a shovel to bury me." I adjusted my grip on my heavy leather briefcase. "You don't get to treat me like a disposable, incompetent IT worker for a decade, actively attempt to steal my home in federal court, and then suddenly demand access to my corporate empire the absolute second you realize I'm incredibly wealthy," I stated with absolute, unwavering finality. "That is not how reality works." I looked at Beatrice, who had been standing silently behind me, watching the entire exchange with the cold, calculated eye of a legal predator. "Beatrice," I said clearly, "have the secondary documents been filed?" They were filed electronically the absolute second Judge Brooks dismissed the conservatorship, Rowena. Beatrice replied smoothly, stepping forward, pulling 3 thick, identical manila envelopes from her briefcase. She handed one envelope to Martin, one to Evelyn, and one to Felicity. They took the envelopes hesitantly, their hands shaking, completely terrified of what new legal nightmare I was unleashing on them. "What is this?" Martin asked, his voice trembling, staring at the thick envelope in his hand as if it were an active bomb. "Those," Beatrice explained, her voice ringing with absolute, predatory legal joy, "are formal summons for a massive civil lawsuit filed in state court." Evelyn gasped, clutching the envelope to her chest. "My client, Rowena Calder, is officially suing all 3 of you, individually and jointly, for severe defamation of character, intentional infliction of profound emotional distress, and attempted grand theft of highly valued real estate." Beatrice detailed, listing the charges with absolute precision. "You're suing us?" Felicity whispered, staring at me in complete, utter horror. "After everything that just happened with Dorian, you're suing your own family?" "Yes, Felicity, I am," I said calmly. "You attempted to use the legal system to aggressively, maliciously strip me of my rights and my assets. You attempted to declare me legally incompetent. Now, you get to experience what happens when the legal system is weaponized against you by someone who actually knows how to use it, and who possesses the unlimited financial capital to fund the litigation indefinitely." I took a final step toward them, ensuring they clearly heard my final, absolute boundary. "You wanted my money so desperately," I said softly, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "Well, you're about to get it. But you're not going to get it in a trust fund, or a condo deed, or a bailout for your criminal son-in-law. You're going to get it in the form of a massive, unrelenting, ruinous legal assault that will bankrupt you in defense fees long before we ever reach a settlement table." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't want to hear them cry. I didn't want to hear them beg. I turned around, my low heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, and walked out of the massive double doors of courtroom 4B, leaving my family standing entirely alone in the silent, empty courtroom, holding the legal documents that would finalize their complete financial ruin. I walked out of the federal courthouse and into the bright, freezing, incredibly crisp Chicago afternoon. The cold air felt amazing. It felt clean. It felt like absolute freedom. My armored, jet-black Range Rover was idling by the curb, exactly where my private driver had parked it. I opened the heavy door, climbed into the luxurious leather back seat, and closed the door, instantly shutting out the noise of the chaotic city. "To the office, Miss Calder?" my driver asked respectfully, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yes, Thomas," I replied, opening my laptop and immediately pulling up the encrypted dashboard for Sentinel ledger systems. "I have a board meeting in 30 minutes regarding the European banking contract. Let's not be late." As the heavy SUV pulled away from the curb and merged into the dense downtown traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the towering, massive glass skyscrapers of the Chicago skyline. For 34 years, I had allowed my family to completely dictate my narrative. I had allowed them to make me feel small, incompetent, and entirely unworthy. I had hidden my massive success, my brilliant company, and my incredible wealth simply because I was terrified of their judgment and their greed. I had played the role of the struggling, invisible IT worker because it was easier than fighting them. But I wasn't an IT worker. I was a titan. I built heavily fortified, highly complex digital fortresses to protect billions of dollars in global assets. I knew exactly how to identify a threat, how to isolate a malicious virus, and how to completely neutralize an attack before it breached the firewall. My family was the virus. And the firewall was finally permanently up. They came into that federal courtroom, expecting to completely destroy my life. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg the judge for mercy. They expected me to passively surrender my condo my independence, and my future to their malicious, entirely manufactured narrative. Instead, they walked directly into an absolute, flawlessly executed ambush. They tried to prove I couldn't manage my life. Instead, they proved they couldn't survive without stealing it. They came for my condo. They left with federal charges, massive civil lawsuits, and the complete, utter destruction of their entirely fake, deeply arrogant reality. So, tell me honestly in the comments below, if your toxic family secretly plotted with a highly arrogant investment broker to drag you into federal court, present forged financial documents, and attempt to declare you legally insane just to steal your paid-off luxury condo, would you panic, scream that they were lying, and try to desperately prove your innocence to a skeptical judge? Or would you sit in absolute silence, let the arrogant broker submit his forged documents under federal oath, and then casually hand the judge a highly classified, sealed SEC folder that exposed his massive embezzlement scheme and revealed your true identity as an $85 million corporate CEO? Let me know. I read every single one.